Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Wade Ellery. I'm the Vice President of Solutions Architects at Radiant Logic. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I have to say this is about an 8,000% increase from the audience I had last year right here at Adeniverse. And I did ask them to fill the room with extra chairs so we could all socially distance, so that's working out really well. And again, I appreciate you being here. What I'm going to talk to you today, and it's not a keynote, it got put on there for me, but I'm going to talk about zero trust in a weekend, or at least a start. But really what I think we were doing as an industry now quite effectively is we're explaining for the first time that a major buzzword that we're all using in the industry is not a solution, it's not a product. Zero trust is really a journey. Zero trust is something that's going to be done over a long course of time and may never end because it's a transformation. It's a change in the way we actually start to look at and manage identity in our environment and how we take on the challenges of offering security, but also offering our customers access to the resources they need to do their job in a manner that makes it as frictionless for them as possible. I want to start out with a quote that actually came out of the DoD, and I'm going to parse this out because I think it's really important. This, for me, is one of the most succinct definitions of zero trust. And again, like an elephant, it is very much in the eye of the interpreter. If you get a hold of the leg of an elephant, you think an elephant's a tree. If you get the trunk, it's a big snake. If you get the tail, it's a brush. Zero trust is really where you're looking from. So if you're a network engineer, you're looking at the edge devices, you're looking at the routers, you're looking at traffic management. Zero trust is all about segmenting your network and controlling physical access of packets around the network. If you're an identity management person, it's all about granting access to users, its groups, its attributes, its policy enforcement at the application level. So what it really comes down to from our perspective is it's a data-centric security model, and that's really important to understand that I'm going to use information to make security decisions. I'm going to look deeply into my organization, gather as much data as I can about the transaction that I'm being asked to evaluate, and then I'm going to make a decision on whether or not I'm going to grant access in a given situation, in a given moment, to a given object that wants that access. It might be a human being. It might be a server making a request to an application on another platform. It might be an edge router that's actually going to send packets across the network. Anything that needs to make a decision on should I let something proceed, should I grant access, needs data to do that. This is a shift. This is eliminating that trusted world we used to live in. The old days, I could build a firewall around my network. I could sit inside the same building. I could wipe my desktops out every night and re-image them. I owned the applications. I could trust everything to be secure because I owned it. That's no longer the world we work in. So we have to be able to operate in a world where trusted and untrusted networks are not the paradigm we're using. And we also have to understand this extends now way beyond people. It extends to devices, personas, in the sense that I have multiple different identities that I interact with different situations and different constituencies. I may be a professor at a university, I may be a doctor at a medical school, I may be a student, and that may be one identity for me in the jobs that I perform in one organization. And then I have to understand processes out there. A lot of processes now, bots, system accounts, other processes are making direct requests for access, and those need to be controlled. So we're shifting this to a multi-attribute based confidence levels. This is being able to decide that I trust what you're asking to do is authorized in the moment based on what I know about you. Now you may look at that and say, well, that's a pretty easy thing to do. If I've got a request coming in from South Korea at 2 o'clock in the morning, the last day of the month, and they're trying to access financial information, I'm going to block that no matter what. That's obvious. Unless your CFO is traveling in South Korea, you know that because your system was able to pull information out of the travel network. He came in with a two-factor step-up, which you saw because you got data coming in off your edge device, and it's the end of the month, and of course at 2 in the morning he's checking the financials because they've got to release to Wall Street on Monday morning, and if you block him, there's going to be a heck to pay. So context makes a tremendous difference in the way we start to authorize when you go to a model where I've actually taken away access now and I'm granting it only when it's requested, only when it's authorized, based on policies, based on rules that I can build around that information. If you have this, you're coming from here, we have this level of assurance, your risk score hasn't gone over a threshold, I can give you access to a resource. And I'm doing that under the concept of least privileged access. This is the piece here that makes zero trust work. I am no longer going to give you the keys to the house and assume you'll act well, and only come after you when you act badly. Or when someone else takes over your account and starts to do things on the network they're not supposed to, I'm not going to react to that. I'm going to prevent this kind of intrusion by controlling access to information up front. You don't get it inherently. It's not the Walmart model where if I come in the front door, I can go any place in the store. It's more like the New York Diamond Center jewelry store where I go in the front door and I'm in a cage and I can't go in to see the diamonds in the showcase until I can prove I don't have a gun and I have a reasonably good credit card. And I'm never going to see the 20-carat diamond in the back safe unless I get a credit report run, and I assure you I can afford to see $1 million diamond. This level of assurance is based on I don't give more access to somebody than they need, and I grant additional access as that process goes on. So this is the DoD's digital modernization strategy. We found that in the federal space, they've been really early adopters of the idea of zero trust. They are driving this forward in almost every area within the Defense Department and within the federal government now. It is like the #1 thing that comes up in the conversation. What is your play around zero trust? Now, as I mentioned before, it's an elephant. It has many different parts, and depending on where you are in the environment, it's a different piece of the infrastructure. We're actually now looking at the things that I can go down to sets of data and assign risk scores to certain types of information and incorporate that in the decision as to whether you get access to that information. It may be financial data, it may be personal information. You may not be in a role that allows you to have access to that data. Now, whether or not I give you that access has to do with everything I know about you, combined with what I know about the endpoint information that you're trying to access. And again, this is an infrastructure where everything works together, but it's all built on the idea of having a tremendously rich set of information to make those decisions. Across the bottom there, you can't really see it, it's very small, but this is the endpoint policy decision point process for evaluating and gaining access to the system, and I'll touch on that again in a moment. It plays out in every segment of the environment. Now, when we're trying to get there in a weekend, we're trying to get to zero trust, well, we have to basically figure out where we are and then build a roadmap to move forward in the zero trust environment. Inherently, over the past 20 years, we've not built infrastructure that was designed for this kind of outcome. It wasn't built around the idea that I have a rich set of identity data that's ubiquitously available, that I can make highly available at speed and at scale for large numbers of users with little effort. There's a lot that has to be done to prepare the environment and move into that context and to change the paradigms or the ways you think about data. So a lot of the organizations we work with in the bottom left there are still in this fragmented world. I work in a siloed environment. I have information in directories, in databases, in edge devices. My customer environment is spread across multiple products within my organization. I don't have a holistic view of that information. So the first thing to do is start to bring that identity data together. Start to recognize when the same object exists with multiple accounts, multiple personas within the organization, how can I bring those back together? Because when I'm evaluating the CFO in South Korea, if I can't access the travel system and look him up in that platform to know where he's traveling, I don't have that information available to me to make a reasonable decision about whether that access should be granted. So the richer the profile I have, the more granular I can make my access. Now again, it's not in a weekend. This is not something you're expected to build out and boil the ocean. This is a journey. So you start out with things you know, things you can start to grab immediately, associations you can make in the data you have, and then start expanding out that data set to look at more and more sources of information. If I've got services accounts inside my privileged account management system, great place to start looking at those. Who owns them? What's their life cycle? What's the reason they're being used? How are they checked out? How do I take that information and incorporate that into policies and turn that into access control measures? And then you want to move on to the idea of context, to be able to actually understand how all this relates together. Who owns this resource? Who manages this resource? Is the CFO happen to be traveling at this point? All the information that I can join together to build that idea and full understanding of that relationship. and then to actually build this into a full infrastructure where I've integrated the hybrid world of on-premise and in the cloud. I'm integrating my employees, contractors, partners, customers, and I'm building a complete system there that allows me to invite people into my organization or merge with another company and integrate that identity information quickly into my system without exposing myself to undue risks, and then plug that additional data sets, those additional objects into my platform and be able to grant control and access as I move forward, auditing, managing, reporting, and maturing this model as I go along. So again, as I said a minute ago, you can't really know where you're going to go until you know where you're starting from. This is the best diagram I could have if anybody remembers the trip to Wally World for National Lampoon's Vacation. This is the roadmap they took. But the point here being that you need to understand where your information is today. And for a lot of us, we don't know. We sit down with customers and ask them, where is all the information about your identity stored? What systems do you have in your platforms? What applications are accessing data to make a decision about access, and where are they getting that from? And it's really not always mapped out. It's not always known. And even if it's identified, if you'll notice around the perimeter here, these are all different types of platforms. My cloud application in Azure, which I'm accessing over a Graph API, is not designed to integrate out of the box with a database table coming in off a SQL database, or something coming out of my HR platform, or information coming off of a Cisco endpoint. All these are disparate types of information that need to be pulled together, that need to be knitted into a complete profile, but inherently are not designed to do that. And that goes back to the assumption that everything is already there and waiting for you when you start to build out your zero trust model. But if you haven't laid that identity foundation, you really don't have the fuel you need to drive those engines in that space. And we're dealing now with a lot more information and a lot more situations. I've got devices that I need to consider now as a whole other set of objects. Devices that I may own, devices my customers may own, devices that may be jailbroken iPads that my employee is using sitting in a hijacked Starbucks cafe Wi-Fi connection. So there's a lot of threat out there in every one of these contingencies. And then also I'm being asked now to manage much larger populations, much larger sets of users, but also people outside my control. I am now a service provider for applications that all the vendors and partners in my industry work with me. They access my data on my systems or my shared platforms to be able to interoperate and cooperate with my organization. But at the same time, a partner in one project may be a competitor in another project, and is definitely a competitor with a different partner on a third project. So there's a need for segregation here. I can't just drop everything into one big pool. So this is, again, a complex problem that if you haven't got your arms around, you'll have some real challenges. Now, what we're trying to get to is sort of an end state is gather all the information on the left, feed it into my policy engines, my tools that decide who gets access to what resource in the moment based on rules that I've written. Policies are just sets of rules. If you're in Chicago and you work in sales and you're on large accounts, you get access to a special pricing model. Maybe that's one of the rules that's been created based on the information that I can gather about you. I can authorize or not your access to that. So again, the assumption is that all that data is readily available. All I need is an orange arrow, and I just point it at my policy engines, and I start to drive that zero trust model into my environment. The challenge is if you actually take a microscope and look at that orange arrow, there is a tremendous amount of functionality that needs to be present to move that data from all those endpoints in disparate structures, schemas, formats, protocols, into something common and actionable that you actually can use in your policy engines. This is what we call the identity data fabric. This is the place where Radiant Logic plays. We are able to connect to all the sources of identity data, pull the information in, and then operate on that data in a way that prepares it for your policy engines to use effectively at scale, at speed, at the speed of a directory. And that incorporates a number of functions here. We're looking at correlating information, the same user in multiple systems. We have to recognize that. We have to integrate all the attributes that may be in different formats and schemas into different systems, map and translate that, synchronize that data, produce potentially dynamic groups based on those attributes so that applications that don't understand attribute-driven access control can use groups, but still benefit from all the granularity of the policy that's being used, and then deliver that to the policy engines, the policy enforcement points, the parts of the system that actually deliver the decision about who gets access to what. This is a fairly common model here. I don't know if you saw Ian Glazier's presentation at Gartner Catalyst 7 years ago, but he put this up on the board and said, in the next 3 years, 80% of the companies in the US will be running on a policy-based access control platform. It took a little longer for us to get here, but we're starting to finally move to this model. And the intent of this model is that on the bottom right, I have a policy information point, all the data I'm going to use to make a decision. On the left, I have a policy authoring point. Where do I write my policies? What's really great now is that companies have built these natural language policy tools where a business line manager can look at a tool and say, if I'm in a drop-down marketing and I'm on television and whatever the other filters are, I get access to certain resources, and those policies can be generated and evaluated pretty quickly. The policy decision point is what makes the decision about the information about the user in the moment relative to the authored policy, and the policy enforcement point is the front end that controls access to that application. I was talking with a company recently that it actually now is intersecting SQL queries, applying a policy, rewriting the query to the database based on obscuring data, encrypting data, only allowing certain data to be brought forward, and then making that query, getting the data, masking it, hashing it, encrypting it, and sending back the result to the user. The application doesn't understand anything different than it used to. It's just a SQL query, but this policy engine could completely remap that SQL query to match up with an access control layer on the enforcement layer, and that can be driven off of policy decision point. So the idea that I can start to apply this in my environment today is actually becoming more and more of a reality, especially if you're talking about edge device access, network segmentation, VPN replacement, modernization. There's a lot of capacity there to control who comes in and out of the network. Now, to just give you a little bit more context about where Radiant Logic sits in this scenario, if you look at the bottom here, this is all the sources of identity data that I have in my environment. And it is a large array that now exists on-premise and in the cloud. And if you look down here, I have IDaaS. I actually have valuable identity information inside my IGA and governance products. It's being used to manage and make roles and provision endpoints, but maybe that role information would be really valuable in a policy enforcement for an access control for something else if I can get that data out and consume it. So Radiant lets you pull that information from those sources and then feed all the engines in the zero trust architecture. These are all players on the stage. They all have different instruments, but they're all playing the same song based on the same information. The intent here is to provide end-to-end security. If this is well orchestrated, then you get a complete solution. To help make that possible, Radiant Logic sits as an abstraction layer, pulls the data up from below, feeds it into those systems in the way they need it, and they each need it a little bit differently. They need a different protocol, they need a different structure, they need a different schema. They need that information in a way that they can consume it more effectively. We call that the identity data fabric. We are the fabric of identity information that feeds those engines. And there are a number of vendors that you'll meet at the expo and a number of others out there that I haven't have logos for that are the pieces of the puzzle that actually do this work. We feed the data to those engines so they're all able to operate from a common set of information, from sources of truth, and leverage that data. And that becomes the identity fabric. If you talk to the analysts now, they're talking about identity fabric as the complete holistic view of managing identity on an end-to-end basis in an ICAM environment. This is the underpinning for everything you do in a zero trust environment. So the key functions here for Radiant Logic are abstracting the information out of the back ends. You want to maintain context. You want to understand relationship and not lose that. You don't want to turn everything into flat skim files because then you lose a lot of the value in the data. Modeling that information because every endpoint needs it differently. I don't want to share all the data I have in my repository with my Azure account. I need to just push into Azure what Azure needs to do its job. Or I may have particular information about partners that I need to segregate within the organization. Being able to manage that now and deliver it as fine-grained information and publishing that out over modern protocols, REST, SCIM, LDAP if you're still writing LDAP queries, be able to integrate that data and do it at scale. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions of objects, hundreds of thousands of queries per second. The ability to authenticate and authorize users and feed those engines is critical, because if you add zero trust to your environment and you slow everybody down, if you cause the business to be angry and upset they can't get access, if the wheel spins on people's desktops, somebody up in the tree is going to pull that out and make you go back to the way it used to work, because you can't handicap the business when you're adding security. This is a massive evolution of security. Done well and done correctly, it can be an almost seamless experience for the user. He only gets challenged when it's appropriate to challenge him. When you know enough to say, go right ahead, he doesn't even know he got checked at the door. He just went right in. Now, feeding this data into a policy decision point is basically, again, integrating information from multiple sources. This is the bread and butter of Radiant Logic. But there's some steps you want to take here. You want to actually normalize the information, because when you're building a policy and you've got 5 different sources and they each hold the location data of state in a different format, you've got to write a policy that says if state is capital C, capital A, or capital A, little a, or misspelled California, all these variations have to be accounted for, or you don't have a policy that'll apply across all of your users. But with Radiant, because we're in between the data and the access points, we can manage that data, normalize the information, regardless of how it sits on the back ends. We can give you a narrow set of data to build policies off of without asking the data owners to change what they're doing. They'll tell you they can't change the format of their state because they have back-end applications that depend on it. That's fine. They don't have to. Just let us see what it is and we'll manage it. Then I give that to the policy authoring point to build off of information that's in my repository, because I want to build my policies on the same information I'm going to evaluate when that user comes into the system. If I don't have that connection, if I'm not using the same data, then I'm going to build a policy that'll never be able to be enabled, or I'm going to have a filter that isn't working against my access controls. I build that same profile for the user off the same normalization, and then I send that over to my policy decision point, and I have a closed loop system here that's using sources of truth to be able to deliver the information necessary for that policy to be effective and to be used. So when you're looking at zero trust, I just want to keep in mind some general fundamentals here that we need to take a look at. The assumption is now that the network is not safe. I used to be able to say, hey, I'm inside an enclosed perimeter, I've got a firewall, I've got virus scanning on my desktops, everybody comes in with a badge on the door, I'm certain I'm okay. Well, if you look at some of the larger breaches and point back to one with a large television and movie house a few years ago, they were that model. They were that monolithic, sealed up environment. Somebody got through, got access to a privileged account and ran amok and made major headlines and even got international exposure with North Korea. So the opportunity to now tighten this up isn't a matter of building higher walls or building deeper moats in your environment. It was Sony. So the idea is to actually change the paradigm, to actually move away from the idea that I've got accounts sitting in my environment where if they get compromised, the game's over. I'm only now doing forensics afterwards. Pull that information in. Privileged account management, I will say in a zero trust environment, every account is a privileged account. It's a spectrum. Some are very low privilege and I don't worry about them so much. Others are higher, but the model I'm taking now is you should only have access to do what you need to do right now. I don't give you access to walk around with. And when you need it, I check it out. I authorize you to have that access. And then when you're done with it, I take it back. And I may check you every 5 or 10 minutes. Or I may have a scenario where I've authorized a session through the policy enforcement point, and on the back end, Radiant recognizes that one of your attributes just got updated. You got moved from one department to another. Or your training certificate just expired. I now can trigger a reevaluation at the policy enforcement point to say, hey, given this change, Do I need to do something about this user's access? Did he just get fired? Do I need to take it out now? Do I need to reauthorize him? Or is it a, hey, no harm, no foul, just let him continue on, don't bother the poor guy? So you've got an ability now to layer in that kind of control and dynamically authorize access continuously. It's a modern approach to security, but it really is where we're all heading. And if you talk to a lot of the folks in the expo, you'll start to see more and more of a move towards that as an underpinning. The other piece of the puzzle is the application development side. And I've been talking to a lot of organizations and analysts on the net new applications, just like when we started to move to the cloud 7 years ago. A lot of cloud apps weren't really SAML or OIDC enabled. They were just somebody's app on a hosted environment. But the industry drove people towards standards. You got asked at the door, does your application support SAML? Can you do OIDC? Great, then we can use you. If you can't, go to the back of the line. You're now going to see net new applications being, hey, can I use a policy enforcement point to do granular access control of your environment? How do I plug you into my zero trust architecture? So the applications will start to mature more and more down this road, and that's sort of a confluence of preparing your environment, building your infrastructure, getting your people in place, and then delivering that solution in a way that it's ready to have that information available when the applications themselves are able to consume it. Or as I mentioned earlier, being able to take information in a product like Radiant and build dynamically group memberships off of that data, materialize those groups so they appear to be static groups to applications that only understand static groups, or they are a group membership in a SAML claim or in an endpoint authorization, and now I'm using attributes to drive the access in my environment, and I've pre-built my policies in that attribute filter, so when I move towards applications that are using real policy-based enforcement, I've already vetted the kind of filtering and access controls I'm going to be using for those particular platforms and situations. One other area to look at is cross-entity collaboration in a zero trust environment. Again, I don't trust you, so if I need to work with you, I'm not going to open a trust between my organization and your organization. I have no idea how much chaos and security holes are on your side of the fence. Or in a merger and acquisition where I've acquired a new organization and I am very reluctant to just say, let's open up a VPN tunnel and pretend we've been working together for 10 years. But I need to be able to share information. I need to be able to get identities from one side of the house into my zero trust architecture. I need to be able to make those identities and their attributes available for my policy enforcement because I have to share application access. I have to do this in as efficiently a way as possible. Now you can look at doing this with federating IDPs, but you get into some real limitations there. You still have a very small attribute set. You're really just doing authentication at that point. So in a zero trust model, the capability of layering in that abstraction layer between two organizations that gives you connectivity but control. This is all filtered and managed and secured at that abstraction layer. Now I can start to share information across organizations. I can start to incorporate other people outside my environment and give them access to my shared resources without having that threat that I have now opened up a door to a world that I don't have control or visibility in. So I'm going to step right now into a global profile demo. I was asked a little bit earlier, are you doing this live? Yes, I am. I just happened to kind of roll that way. But let me bring this down. This is actually all running on my system here. You can see my laptop. And let me go over here just to give you an idea of what it looks like when you're starting to build out an infrastructure around the concept of a zero trust model. And of course, everything timed out. So first of all, as I said earlier, is just visibility. Can I go in and see everything in my organization? When I have built that correlation, when I built that abstraction layer, then what can I do with that information? Well, the actual value here is, and this is a visual representation of what your applications are actually doing. So you can see this from a visual standpoint. You can run reports against it. You can operate on it. You can use this as a management tool. But it also helps you understand that on the back end, I have one endpoint to connect to, and I have one global profile for Autumn Anderson. But the system also has the ability to drill into other components that make up that global profile. So I can pull more detailed information out of this profile about Autumn's access in different platforms across untrusted AD domains, across an HR backend that's coming off the cloud, across the Salesforce endpoint sitting up in the cloud. Again, these are all disparate systems, different APIs, different connectivity, and because some of these are cloud-based, I'm storing this information at the Radiant Logic level. I'm listening for changes on the back end because this information has to be performant. You don't want someone sitting there waiting for you to make a decision while you call out to Salesforce and query. I get frustrated when the Salesforce wheel spins just loading my contact information. You don't want to put that in the middle of someone's authorization step. So we pull this information and gather that together. Now, just to give you a little of a look behind the scene here, I've got now built out a full rich profile of identity information. You can see data coming in from multiple sources here. Federated ID is actually coming out of my Salesforce piece. I've got multiple attributes because I have multiple AD domains, so logon data is coming in from multiple sources. All this richness is available behind the scenes, and I can also incorporate other constituencies in the system. So I have Angel Brown. Angel Brown doesn't work in corporate. He doesn't have an AD account. All he has is an HR record and an employee database record because he's just a store employee. But I have one place to go to access all the information across my very rich set of corporate employees, my narrower set of store employees, my students, my patients, my members, whatever information you incorporate, I can bring this in, and I can choose to segregate that data, but I can also make it available for access management, for governance, from a unified profile. And again, this is all information that we're managing and controlling at our level so that you can be able to expose this information to multiple endpoints. Now, if I want to, I can run reports against this data, and this is one that actually sort of fell out of my data set here because I didn't know I had done this when I built this. So I'm looking for store employees that still have an AD account because that shouldn't happen. They should never have had an AD account. So did someone create an AD account for them? Look, I got 6 people that are in my store employee database that have AD accounts. If I look at Kerry Rodriguez and I go back to a store employee, I see that he was a trainee. He had a hire date in 98. He's no longer, actually I haven't terminated him yet. But if I also look now at my global profile, I've got C. Rodriguez, which I've joined all my profile information on. But if I go into my New York domain, I can actually see that the AD domain information is coming from a Kerry Rodriguez. My store employee is with a Y instead of an IE, if you can see that differentiation. Basically, 2 different people that inadvertently got put together. Now, there's tools in Radiant Logic to prevent that from happening, but the quality of the data has an impact on this. So now you can start to not only put this information together, but run analytics against it and start to look for those anomalies, look for those situations where I've got overlapping identities that shouldn't be joined together. I've got people that have existing accounts in the store employee that have never been cleaned out. They got reused because it was not unique in AD, so I could create our J. Rodriguez or C. Rodriguez a second time. So the key here is being able to see this information, clean this information up, and I'm not impacting the back-end systems. I am just reading the data from those back-ends. If I want to write updates, if I want to be a source of truth, that's available to push that information out, but it doesn't have to be the way that I actually impact the information. I can do all this as a view to the data, and not have to do anything to disrupt the back-end or to make changes. And just to give you an idea of how this is configured, you'll see I've got multiple sets of information here. Within these platforms, I have a set of correlation rules that let me map the data. I can build very complex expressions in my correlation logic to map those users across the system. And I can go in and map now extensive data for the source of information across a very rich and robust schema that's completely extensible here. And that's the other key piece, is that the traditional directory systems are not designed to hold this kind of information in a zero trust model. Device data, travel data, training information, security information, those are all fields and attributes that are not designed to be incorporated in a traditional directory. Because we're schema agnostic, because we can pull in additional data sets from any source, we can build that rich, robust set of data that can be accessed and queried from anywhere, and we can format that data in the structure, in the schema, and the labels that individual systems are looking for, so they're going to get exactly what they want. And I can do that simultaneously in multiple different views, so each system gets a tailored set of data from common sources of truth at the level of performance that they're looking for. Just to step over to one last piece here, I want to give you an example of what it looks like when you have a common identifier. I'm now logging into that profile in Radiant Logic through a single sign-on solution. And this is Autumn Anderson, who you saw a minute ago, who had a rich profile here. So I see in Autumn now that I've got AD information. I color-coded this so you could kind of distinguish the different sources. I was told by one person I demonstrated this to, oh, I love this product. The fact that you color-code everything, I just can't wait to have that in my environment. And I said, well, I'm sorry, this is just HTML code. It's not the product. We don't color code the endpoints. You have to do it in your own graphical interface. But the point here is I have multiple sources of data exposed for Autumn Anderson here. She authenticated to that endpoint. I can drill down and authorize access here for her in multiple scenarios. But at the same time, I can go back in, as our friend a minute ago, Angel Brown, log into the same endpoint. So my single sign-on platform, my policy enforcement point has one point to go, to authorize all the identities, objects, devices, users in my organization against the data set that I have in the background. So I don't have to stand up individual systems. I don't have to have a different platform for my vendors and my partners. If I've got customer information, I can make that all available from a common interface, or in a merger and acquisition, I can start exposing my organization to my new acquisition without having to build new infrastructure. You can see Angel has a much more narrow profile here, and there's certain places he can't go because he doesn't have the access rights, because he doesn't have the profile information that we're looking for to grant that access. So the ability to build this large unified set of data, delivered as it's needed, and be able to create common points of access are critical to moving into a zero trust model, because you want to remove friction, you want to build as rich a profile as you can, you want to move this forward as fast as you can. And again, it is a journey. The nice thing about Radiant Logic is that you can model all this without disrupting anything on the back end. I can do a whole bunch of what-if designs. Let me see if I put these things together. What does my data quality look like? And then incrementally add additional sources and information into my profile. The set gets richer. I get more things to control, more things to manage. So I'm going to end the demonstration there and open up to any questions that anyone may have, or anything else I can do to augment what I've said so far. And I will take stunned silence as a great endorsement. Yep. Yes. And from Radiant Logic's standpoint, we don't understand or care where the data comes from. If it uses a standard protocol or a flat file or a documented API, we can access that data and bring it down. In fact, for a lot of our customers, we're pulling out a lot of information from the cloud. But on the other side, for Baylor Scott & White, which is one of the largest Texas healthcare organizations, they have built views of the data for each endpoint they're provisioning in the cloud. So I only provision into ServiceNow the accounts that should be in ServiceNow with only the attributes that ServiceNow needs. If I get an on-premise change in that data set, I automatically refresh or remove that account in ServiceNow. And by doing this with each endpoint, they've narrowed down the amount of information sprawl that they have out in the cloud. They have a track on every place they provision an endpoint user, and they pull that information back into Radiant as part of the profile. So when you're doing attestation reviews, you're feeding it into your IGA platform, all that connectivity, all that data is there. Yep. Yes, you can access it through REST, SCIM, or LDAP. And we can even put it into a JDBC-driven SQL table. So if you've got reporting tools that only understand to make SQL queries, data can be available that way. The REST interface is fully enabled to do everything you can do in an LDAP directory. It's a SCIM2 interface on the SCIM side, fully extensible. And I heard someone say yesterday, most vendors that claim they have SCIM haven't really gotten it worked out yet. We put a lot of effort into building SCIM as a back-end source so we can read and pull SCIM in, and exposing the front end to SCIM. Even things like blobs now within the data sets can be exposed through a SCIM interface. So you've got a lot of access to the data. Thank you. Sir? That's an excellent question. So, and the question, just to repeat for people that hadn't heard it, how do you help this tool with an IGA deployment that's struggling? And a lot of times you'll see one of the biggest challenges in an IGA deployment is they're doing something very similar. They're trying to connect to all those sources of identity and environment so they can bring that information in and start to analyze that data to build roles and entitlements and do attestation and segregation of duties, to do all the governance and provisioning functions. The value of Radiant Logic is that we spent 20 years building this tool. This is all mouse-driven. Everything I did here was done with a mouse. I don't write code. So I can take a very complex, chaotic environment and make it look very normal, very simplified, put a common identifier on every source because I can do the correlation. And when I feed that into my IGA platform as individual parallel feeds of data, everything has a common identifier. Everything has been normalized. The nested groups have been flattened out. Everything the IGA platform needs to get to work immediately has already been done. So it makes it very simple and very easy. In fact, Gartner's quote was, if you do what they call cleanup analytics, if you actually take care of the data before you add it in, you'll double the ROI on your IGA deployment. And if you've been through one before, you remember the headache of just the months it took to get the first 3 systems in. And sometimes you end up running out of time and budget and declaring victory, and you didn't get half of the scope done that you wanted to do. So in this scenario, you get to do that information and get it into the system much faster. And now you can start doing the fun stuff instead of your IGA project and really returning the value of that investment. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
When you're calling to get the policy decisions out,
Yeah.
is there some standard that you're following for the API for that? Is there a standard for that?
Well, there's an evolving standard, OPA, which is where, and it's an interesting question because I sat down with one of our developers and I said, hey, if I built all my policies in product A and then I moved to product B, can I just move my policies over? And they said, likely not, because everyone was writing proprietary policies. OPA is kind of like SAML OIDC for policies. We're getting more and more adoption. We're seeing more vendors now start to move towards that as a policy authoring standard. We'll see, it's like SCIM. When SCIM first came out, it was a great standard, but it was very narrow. You only had so many attributes. So it'll probably evolve to a richer model, but it seems to be where things are moving. From our standpoint, we're literally seen as a standards-based backend. So for many of the access control layers, we connect through SAML. They pull us as a SAML token for the user in the session request, or they pull it back as an LDAP request because they're used to pulling data out of LDAP, or a combination of that. And again, REST and SCIM are available. So our intent is to play with everybody, and then as standards evolve, we'll incorporate those more and more into the system. Yeah. Sir?
You can kind of showcase the identity from like the human identity side, but what about some of the other components you're talking about, like applications, devices, et cetera?
That's one of the really nice, and just to repeat the question, sorry, the question was, we talked a lot about human identity, which is where we kind of all inherently come from when we think about identity. But object is really the way we address this. I have an object that has attributes and relationships. If that exists, I can manage that in Radiant. So one example is we have a large telco in Eastern Europe that is managing all of their customers, but they're also managing all the plans that the customers have on their systems. And those plans in a telephone, if you've got kids and phones, you understand, I've got my plan with my AT&T, I've got 5 phones, 2 iPads, I've got a spouse who can do everything, I've got kids who are limited based by their age, you can buy stuff, you can't, I've got all these policies enforced, and those are in documented policy statements inside their CRM system. We've integrated that into the identity profile, so now when the access control layer in their system is asking, can Johnny download this app while he's driving across the Autobahn with his parents, the system can look in one place and find all that information. So not only can we expand to hold additional attributes and additional objects, we're platform agnostic, schema agnostic. So if you've got devices with a whole bunch of attributes that you wouldn't normally see in a user profile, or if you're looking at something like a security platform where I have clearances and I have expiration dates and I have owners and all the other functions, all that data can be managed as part of the profile, or I can manage that as an object. I can have a plan, a data plan that has attributes about it and then relate that to other objects and join those together. Yes, and the nice thing about it is if the information happens to be in a database, We can connect to the database and automatically extract all the column headers and build a schema for you automatically from that. If it's coming off of an API, as long as it's well documented, we can build a schema off of that. So it's very quick to pull in additional data and extend that. And then in that global profile that I had up a minute ago, I just add those additional attributes onto my list of attributes in that profile that I can associate data to. Yeah. The system doesn't know if you've got a heartbeat or you're plugged in the wall. It doesn't really care as long as you have attributes and relationships. Any other questions? 3 minutes left. We're just starting to see that now in the industry, that they're building policy enforcement points that are doing application to application or server to server or server to application authorization. So in an OIDC call, I may be an application being called by a server who's asking for information on my behalf someplace else. That is now looking at being managed also. So that, again, you look at that server as an object. He has attributes and relationships. You build policies that says this server can access this data at these time frames for these people under these circumstances. So you can build those same policies around that. The key is, right now, is the enforcement piece is where the maturity needs to grow, is that I need to be able to get in between that conversation and be the traffic cop. That's the piece at the very top of that puzzle. We can provide the data if we can access it. The traffic cops are where things are evolving now, but I'm starting to see organizations that we're talking to, partnering with, saying, hey, we're not just doing people, we're doing people on one layer and server application on another layer. So I'm doing network segmentation and I'm doing server to application segmentation on top of identity. So I've got 3 layers of control now. You've got to get through 3 layers of gates before you actually get the data back to yourself. So we're seeing that happen now. It's just early. It depends. The question is, do you start out small and scale out to more layers? It almost depends on the elephant model. Who's got the momentum or the budget or the visibility? Some organizations are immediately looking at network segmentation. Ransomware scares them to death. If I get it on my laptop can never reach the financial network subnet, no matter what. So it's never going to be able to transit over there. So they're literally looking at locking down traffic. And that management, you start really on the server side and traffic management side. Others, you're looking at application controls in that layer. So it really depends on where the initiative is starting. But you do always want to start small. You always want to start with something narrow that you can define. Any troubleshooting scenario, when you go in and change 4 things and it fixed the problem, you have no idea which of the 4 did it. So you always want to start with as much segmentation as possible. But the nice thing about it is it's a dynamic platform, so you can add on, and it doesn't break or change what you're already doing. You can do things in parallel. You can do things in a serial model. All right. Well, we're at the top of my time. I appreciate everyone's presence today and your attention, and thank you.